Thursday, March the 2nd to order. On our agenda today is a hearing on Senate Bill 256. David, do you have a bill brief for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Senate Bill 256 would remove the current formula for determining an additional interest credit or a dividend for the KPERS 3 cash balance plan members in calendar year 2023, so the current year, and would instead provide just a 1% dividend for calendar year 2023. If you might remember the cash balance plan under KPERS 3, there's employee accounts, employer accounts, and they get a guaranteed interest rate of 4% each year. And then there's this additional potential dividend based on it's a formulaic calculation right now that provides a dividend would be equal to 75% of the 5-year average net compound rate of return as determined by the KPERS board for that calendar year and the previous 4 calendar years on the market value of the system's assets. That's above 6%. So right now that's the current law. This would just say in calendar year 2023, it's just going to be 1%. Don't run the formula, but then reinstate the formula for calendar years 2024 and thereafter. The bill also then strikes some prior calendar year calculations for 15, 16, 17, since those dates have now passed and then no longer needed as we were ramping up the additional dividends under when the plan first started. The bill becomes effective upon publication in the statute book, and I can stand for any questions.
David, thank you. Committee, are there questions of David? I see none. Thank you. Next, we will turn our attention to Alan Conroy, Executive Director of KPERS. Welcome, Alan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Glad to be here. Of course, David's done a good job on explaining 2556 and maybe just a little more background. Remember, Cash 3 is a cash balance plan, still a defined benefit, employee contributions, employer pay credits, and then then the interest part that may be earned on their notational account. As David has indicated, this bill would provide for a guaranteed 1% increase in their account. KPERS 3 members, all of them are guaranteed 4% annually. So unlike kind of the attributes of a 401k, in terms of the cash balance plan, they're guaranteed 4% on their account. And of course, they never lose what's been contributed into this account. This bill would provide for 1 year, they would get an additional 1% rather than following the formula, and that formula on these optional additional dividend payments are tied to how the KPERS trust fund is doing. And as David indicated, there's that formula, 5-year average net compound rate of return, the amount above 6%, and then it's 75% of that, and is how that works. And on the second page of my testimony is just the table that shows the historical track record of whether or not this optional or additional dividend credit has been paid or not. The KPERS board will take up the issue at their March meeting, and of course, based on the returns in the trust fund for calendar year 2022, there will be no, based on the formula, there would be no additional optional dividend credit. So for 2022, they just members would just get the guaranteed 4%. And then there's just that note, we have a question whether the intent of the bill was to apply to 2022 or 2023, but that can be worked out later. So certainly glad to respond to questions when appropriate.
Alan, thank you. Could you give us a brief explanation? I think the intention maybe was to count 22, but I don't think we got the correct information to the reviser. So what would it look like if we did put an amendment in to go back to 22 instead of 23?
Right. So we did ask our actuary in terms of the actuarial cost, because so that guarantees that 1% that would be paid. And of course, in the grand scheme of things, this is only for 1 year, so it's only 1%, just applies to Capers, three account members. The increased liability is $3.4 million, but if you amortize that as a benefit increase over 20 years, then, so for state, school, and local contribution rates would go up 0.01%, or it's $250,000 annually for 20 years for practically all of the Capers employers, state, school, and local. So again, since it's only one time, the actuarial cost is very minimal.
Committee, are there questions of Alan? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. So when we look at the table here, our rate, average net rate of return in 2022 was 5.7. Is that correct?
In 2022, it was negative. I'm sorry. Oh, that's right. The 5-year average is correct. That's right. So that'd go back 5 years. That's right. Which would be below the 6%, which wouldn't trigger the additional dividend payment. I'm sorry.
Right.
Slow on the update. Thank you, Jared.
So if we're taking the average net return of 5.7, that's actually better than adding 1% to 4%, making 5%, right?
Well, this 5.7 doesn't get you over one of those hurdles to even do that. It has to be at least 6% to allow for the, under current law, based on that additional optional dividend payment. So that number would have to be, and again, it's that 5-year average, but the numbers aren't there to trigger in based on calendar 2022 and the 5-year average. It won't trigger the optional dividend payment, if that responds to your question.
And did you happen to run, if we were to keep this 5% past 1 year, so that it would be a minimum of 5% versus 4%?
I'm not sure we have that right with us, but we've got some numbers available from the actuary. I think one run I believe we might have is looking at where it originally started out, which was a guaranteed rate of 5.25.
Right.
And so, and then ultimately it was rolled back to what we see here at the 4%. And I'm sorry, I don't have those numbers. We could probably get them before the end of the meeting for you.
I recall the number was less than $100 million, I believe, right?
In total, yes.
In total?
That's right, yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Conroy, for your presentation. I was wondering, you got a dividend calculation example. Do you have the actuals since this started in 2015, just to get a feel of where we've come from as we stand here today? You probably don't have that with you, but I'd find that interesting.
Sure, the sort of the next level of detail beyond that second table that just shows the grand total, is that? Yeah.
Example
Yeah.
here, if we had something that showed 2015, 16, 17.
Yes, on page 2, if that addresses your.
Oh, that's where it does it. Okay.
That's where we've done it. It doesn't show the actual calculations, but.
That's got the deal.
Okay.
Thank you. And my second question, we put our portion of this in, and then the cities and counties, and will they have a problem with something like this? Because there's going to be additional cost on their budgets. Conversation about
I mean, it would be factored into the next valuation when those employer contribution rates are set. But again, this in isolation, that employer contribution rate in like locals, it's a little over 8%, a little over 12% for state school. This is out to the second decimal point, so it's that 0.01% increase. So there might be other things in that next valuation when those employer contribution rates are set. Should this pass, mortality, longevity or mortality, credit service, how long are people working, and all those kinds of things that, there'll be pluses and minuses, and this would just be added into that calculation.
Thank you.
Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, why Capers 3 and not the other two?
Good question. Capers 3, since it is a cash balance plan, sort of a hybrid plan, so these dividend credits, so employee contributions, employer pay credits, as it's called there, and then this interest, that's how the benefit is eventually, those factors, when the individual gets ready to retire, those three sort of sources of money, then whatever's in that bucket for that individual is annuitized, and that's their lifetime benefit. Capers 1 and 2 are true defined benefit plans, so it's final average salary, years of service, and then a multiplier. Most people, it's 1.85%. So the ups and downs on the market or the trust fund do not impact Capers 1 or 2 members. The employer's on the hook. If there's great, that'll be reflected in lower employer contributions should the market do really well. If it's not so strong, then it's still reflected, to the employer. So it's all that risk. Capers 1 and 2, the employer's on the hook for everything. They have all the risk. Capers 3, this hybrid, it's kind of halfway in between, and this is one of the ways to share some of that risk with the members, so it's not all on on the employers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a second time. We talk a lot about the cost. Cost seems very, very, very minimal to a plan that needs fixed, in my opinion. Capers 3, it's really the bronze level or lower in terms of the standard of retirement plans for our state employees. One time, we're doing this for 1 year. Seems very, very, very minimal, and we need to talk about the impact this is going to have on anybody out there. Will it have an impact on any of our Tier 3 employees or retirees?
And again, the way it works, so it would go into their account, and of course, Capers 3 is just 2015. Our largest group of Capers are in Capers 3 now, but it has, the way it works, though, or to the best benefit, if they have long, 20 or 30 years of service, we have a lot of time then to invest that, to maximize that. So 1%, so somebody who's going to retire next year out of Capers 3, it will help, but it will be, I guess, no benefit increase should be minimal, but would not probably move the needle much in terms of that final benefit for that member, let's say if they're going to retire next year.
Sure. Really, the benefit of an interest point is year-over-year compounding, and that's the secret, not a 1% one-time pump up, in my opinion. But I appreciate the initial intent here to fix the Capers 3. Thank you.
Committee, additional questions of Alan? Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I look at that calculations on page 2, the reason for the 4% floor kind of protects people in bad years, right?
That is correct.
So in 2015, there was a 0.2% return, so they got 4%. So it kind of takes the highs and the lows out of this kind of thing.
Exactly, and that's by design. Yep, you
Yeah,
got it.
So as we look forward, they have had dividend credits. I see a couple nice ones on here too. So I just, I hear what you're saying. I'm just saying that's there for a purpose too. Thank you.
Senator Dietrich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think, though, if I'm understanding this correctly, the value isn't immediate. It's going to be something that's compounded over time. Nobody's going to be retiring, I wouldn't think, out of Tier 3, because you would have come in 2015, 16. So you wouldn't have probably any reason to use those points to retire at that point, right?
We've had a few retirees start from Capers 3, and some of them may have had some prior service, and then they'd left, and so they came back, and so once they come back, if they aren't vested, then they're in Capers 3, but your point's correct.
So this would be a benefit over time. Yeah. And one follow-up, if I could. So how long do you think it would take before you would see that benefit grow at a rate that would be, reasonable? Maybe I should say acceptable to the retiree, not reasonable.
Length of time?
Yeah, what do you think?
Probably, you're looking at probably 15, 20 years. It's, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Additional questions for Alan? See none. Thank you, Alan. We will now turn to our proponents. First up, we have our state treasurer, Stephen Johnson. Mr. Treasurer, I can tell you that the institutional knowledge on pensions funds when you left, it voided the whole place.
Tiny change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. Great to get to be with you, and thanks for considering this and the questions you've already asked to try and figure out where do we go going forward. So I have some written testimony, but what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about what I remember of the history, which could be fallible. A little bit about what has actually happened, which you see some from the director's testimony, and a little about what your options are. And then to that, some good discussion that's here. And I think the chair has talked about a special committee to look at what the long-term fix may be. And I think this was to look at, do we do something now for Tier 3 to get us to that point? Or might we have a long-term fix in place yet this session? So as we work through those considerations, back to 2011 and 2012, when this was done, and the chairman was here, so he understates the value of his knowledge on what is there. The goal had been a couple, but mostly to make sure our contributions met the liability. And as the cash balance plan was looked at, there was an effort to try and design, okay, do we do a defined contribution plan? Do we stick with a defined benefit plan? How do we try to get to something that the employees tell us they want and that we can close this gap going forward? So the cash balance plan was the compromise that wasn't anyone's first choice. But in that, to the vice chair's point, the 4% minimum was set to be some floor upon which people could still plan versus having no floor in the defined contribution plan, and one which would not be overly expensive to the state to provide that 4% guarantee over time, looking at the numbers. We then tried to figure out how do we provide additional equity from the return of the portfolio, which we assumed there would be. We struggled with how to model that. And it's possible someone could have an idea of how to do it, and the actuary took a stab at it for us. And the formula that we have, which I'm glad to go through if you want to, and you probably already know it, was set to provide a 6.25% total return over time. Our desire in setting that formula was to say, okay, we're making roughly a 3% contribution. It grows over time. In a vacuum, that's our normal cost. I'm using figures, so watch the tension in the director's face as I inappropriately describe some things to share how I understand it in my head. But if I'm making a 3% contribution to that account and it actually costs me 4%, that means I'm paying out more than my full return. Well, that was a concern at the time. So how do we set a formula which is somewhat under that full amount so that it doesn't cost us more than the return on the portfolio to meet what we're doing? So through that effort, we said, okay, here's a formula that should pay out a reasonable share of that additional return over time. What we didn't know is will it, right? But that was the target that was in the head of a couple of us that were looking at it. We'll be in that 6.25% range, maybe at 6%. I did check with the staff. With the reduction in the earnings assumption, that reduced the assumption to 6% in the actuary's number. I actually thought it could get reduced further than that by changing the average return over time, but it's the volatility that speaks to it, and you saw that in how the numbers were being paid out. But that then is what we wanted to look at and I think relook at. Is it providing the equity in that formula, or does that formula need to change, or whichever of those pieces? And I'll get to that and what we can do next. But looking at what happened, the testimony previous was very helpful to see how those were paid out on page 2. I am surprised at the volatility that a 5-year average that was pretty strong could be decimated by last year. So it's pretty good to have a bad year where I still get a positive return. So I do want to start with that. I don't want to say that it's a great return, but that's pretty good. In light of everything that's going on and in light of the other benefits where Tier 1 and Tier 2 are calculated with their normal cost and everything, and you've only got three, you like four variables, dollars in, what you earn, and dollars out. If you follow Alan's or the director's testimony, he'll specify expenses as a specific part of that also. But if I reduce how much we make on the portfolio, I have to put more dollars in, right? So trying to work through all of those pieces and looking at where we are in the payout for tiers 1 and 2, they are assumed to always make whatever that return is, and we put it in. So they're actually, in the calculation, continuing to make that 7% over time. This group is not. And that's where we were looking at not only this year, which is the right questioning, how does this work over time, but as we look historically, the payouts haven't been 6%, right? If you average what we have paid out, it has been less than that. We had a couple pretty good years. A year ago, I thought we were set for another good year in the payout that would come. It looks like we don't have to hit a very high hurdle to have good returns again in the future. This one will haunt us for its years in the formula. But in lieu of that, long-term, how do we relook at that overall benefit? Is that where we want it to be? Short-term, what might we consider? So I'll stop talking on that and get to those options. As I see it, there are three variables in the benefit that we can look at. One is the amount we contribute. How much do we contribute in salary each year? The next is, what is the guarantee? Do we raise that guarantee? And the other is, how do we adjust the formula to make the payout where we want it? And where's the best win overall for that? As you look at the thinking that we had, the higher we make the guarantee, the lower we can share the performance of the portfolio. So which trade-off is best over time for the employees if a cash balance plan is the answer? So to that extent, we started with a 1%, not because we necessarily knew it was the right answer, but we knew once we got that fiscal note, you could easily figure out what's 2% if you wanted to do it. And looking at what the fiscal note is and looking at what has happened, if we would consider a contribution as a credit to the account, one of the things I like about that is someone who's been here since 2015 has accrued more in their account, and they get a little more than somebody who's been here for 1 year. So I think it helps to make up for the equity using that particular variable, looking all the way back over those years where it was low and considering what that is. I don't know what the right amount is. I will have one other editorial comment for me. My preference would probably be to look at a 2%, which is a little more meaningful for them to get, to say we are concerned about this. And I would actually consider looking at an appropriation through Ways and Means that just pays it for our side. I would be inconsistent if I testified on behalf of a benefit that I didn't pay for. I very much like to see us pay for increases in benefits as we go. I feel looking at our budget, that is an option that we could consider. I think the question of the impact on the municipalities is a very good one to ask them. What would a 0.01 or 0.02 increase in your payment do? Is that a concern, or is that something you'd want for your employees? But considering each of those, I think that working through those issues, this just provides an option if the legislature wanted to do something for those Tier 3 employees at this point in time, considering where we are financially and considering how that formula has worked and whether or not we can come up with a permanent fix or if you wanted to take action in the next weeks. So thank you for listening and the chance to be with the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Are there questions? Senator Pittman?
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Treasurer. Just to clarify, you said 2%. 2% for would be instead of the 1% added for 1 year listed in this bill. You're specifically you would think that 2% might be a better option, obviously wanting to look at the finances, but understanding that it's not that much more for 1 year, right?
Right. So, and again, I certainly defer to the legislature and your wisdom to figure out where that fits. But as an example, you can scale that 1% fairly easy. If we looked at 4.6% on our budget for the state and the additional hit to the county, where is that? You may come up with a different number than that, but thanks for considering.
And did you ever look at, instead of the 3% contribution, going up to the full 6% contribution from the employers?
The annual contribution for each group, just moving that number up. Another thing that we certainly could consider, and if the legislature has the time and energy to dive into more details, I'd encourage that conversation. I don't know if that's the first solution that I would come to, if you're asking my opinion, but that's absolutely one of your levers on the table.
Thanks.
Committee, additional questions? Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first time we kind of looked at this and you get to thinking of it. So this will be a lot of thought to put into this. When I looked at this dividend credit calculations, and it's an average of 5 years. So when it started out, that was just a 1 year, then went 2 year. So when you get down the full deal, well, then you're seeing some positive numbers. This dividend credit is on top of 4%. So each one of these, I think as we go into 23 and 22, we know both the bond market and the stock market was down. And I think there'd be a whole lot of people that would be happy to have returns that they're going to have in their capers compared to people outside. So I'm just saying that I want to make that comment for my opinion. So we're not going to see that, but it's going to be coming here. Thank you.
Stephen, if I understood you correctly, your recommendation or would be to put an amendment on the bill to go back to add 22 versus 23. Correct. And then also that this committee consider somewhere between 1% and 2%.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. And on the first point, absolutely. We wanted the dividend in 2023. If we calculated on the December 23, which was probably lack of clarity on my part as well, we need to base it on December 22 value. So that is a technical change on the year, but an important change for what we do. And then it would only be, in this case, a 1 year look, in that we would not want to replace the formula with a fixed percent. Especially if it's 1%, right? A larger one, perhaps someone could argue for. So that change is very important. What is the right amount? I don't know that I have the answer. I really appreciate the comments for last year's performance. Actually, Tier 4 was a good deal for last year. This one, in my opinion, makes up more for past debts, where some of those dividends were maybe lower than they needed to be, looking at some of the good years while they were still good payouts given the fixed, weren't a super high payout as we look at the return of the portfolio over the entire time versus the return of the payout. I think it's possible we would close that gap somewhat. And so the question is not as much a function of the timing of the return as the design of the overall formula and trying to create some equity, and by doing it on the account value, catching up for a few years in that. Something to consider whether or not we agree that Tier 3 has a weaker benefit than 1 and 2, and that's something we want to remedy, a possibility that we could get our heads around more quickly.
Okay. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr. Treasurer. So if I'm understanding this correctly, if the return is less than the 4.9%, that's when the 1% would be added? Do I have that right?
So I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but given that the return for last year was low enough to eliminate the formulaic dividend and there isn't anything more paid out, and given the historically lower payouts than what we had originally thought of, summing somewhere around that 6% figure, might we just make up a statutory dividend credit rather than this formulaic one in this year, given equity between plans and given the overall revenue situation that we have.
So then who pays the 1%? Is that the state general fund that pays the 1%?
So ultimately, yes. If we don't make an appropriation, it would be paid out of the UAL, which is still the state general fund, paying that portion over time. I stated my personal preference of paying it up front, that I like to look at the benefits I grant and know that I have a plan to pay them, rather than granting the benefit and asking someone else to pay it.
So will somebody who's testifying today, are you aware, will they be speaking to the fiscal note then?
So I don't know to that. I looked at it just briefly before I arrived, and I think I saw that from the Department of Budget, where it stated that the UAL would increase by 3.4 million, and we might look to Capers to make sure that I'm correct on that. But 2.3 was for the state school group, and the other was for the local group. So the 2.3 would be the impact to the state general fund over time for 1%, and the 1.1 would hit the local group, and how they would choose to pay for that. I would assume the local group would pay it over time as opposed to a lump sum. It is possible the legislature could consider paying ours at a point in time just to take care of that additional cost.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Stephen, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We will now turn our attention to Ernie Claudel on behalf of the Kansas Coalition of Public Retirees.
Thank you very much.
Ernie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening. This is a interesting bill for us. I would have great trepidation testifying against this because as I talk to people in and out of the building and across the aisle and on both ends of the building, there's a great deal of concern about the Tier 3 return as compared to Tier 2. Most of the Tier 1 people, by the way, there aren't very many of us left. The idea of helping the people out during this time would be great. The only thing that I would caution is that you would not consider this to be any kind of a permanent fix. To just be, because that's what several of the bills that have come forward this year haven't known whether to testify neutral or in favor of, because for fear they would be seen as some kind of a permanent fix. And I don't think that's the case. The comparison between the best you could compare, I talk about comparing the Tier 2 and Tier 3 is like not apples and oranges even, but apples and dump trucks because they're so different. But the calculations are truly startling. The difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3. And on that, I would stop and see if there's any questions. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman and committee, for listening to me.
Ernie, thank you for your testimony. Are there questions? I see none. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now turn our attention to neutral oral testimony. We have Tim Graham representing the Keeping the Kansas Promise Coalition. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, sir. Good to be before you for the first time this year and before some of the rest of you for the first and many times, I guess, some of you. I'm submitting testimony today on behalf of Keeping the Kansas Promise, as you said. Keeping the Kansas Promise, or KKP, is a coalition of public employee organizations that include teachers, public safety workers, as well as state, city, and local employees that have coalesced to advocate for sound policy regarding their Capers retirement benefits. I encourage you to read our testimony. It is a combination of different shared opinions that we've put together, but I'm going to go in a slightly different direction on my oral testimony. First of all, again, I do appreciate the opportunity to be here to submit this neutral testimony. We also thank you for recognizing that Tier 3 needs some serious reform. At least I assume there's a recognition there. I appreciate also Senator Gossage's question about the differences between Tiers 1 and 2 and 3. I think it's important that all of you and everybody else understands the stark differences between 1 and 2 and 3. Tiers 1 and 2 have always been considered pretty good pensions. KPERS, which started back in the 60s, at that time was probably one of the best pensions in the country. And over the course of time, we seem to have watered that down. So I appreciate your question and would invite further conversation if you would ever be interested. And that is to the rest of you as well. So from the perspective of everything I just said, we appreciate your efforts here. However, I'm not sure, and we're not sure that Senate Bill 256 is the answer. And let me give you a few of our concerns, which Ernie has articulated a few of those. But, based on Alan Conroy's testimony, we're not sure that the dates are written in a way that would be tremendously helpful, although Treasurer Johnson did alleviate a little bit of my heartburn there with some of the things he said, so thank you, sir. Most importantly, I would refer to to Alan Conroy's testimony, where he says that if calendar 23 returns meet or exceed 4.9%, this would actually be a cut in the possible dividend credit based on the statutory formula that's at the bottom of his testimony. Now, again, if we were to bump that to 2%, that may not be the case, but I'm still not sure, and I'm not great at math on the fly. So, but set aside that for a minute, and let's talk about a dynamic that I see. And for those of you that don't know, I've been a product of this environment for, I'm not good on math again, for 25 years. I've grown up in this environment, and most of you remember when I had dark hair. So I understand what the dynamic we're kind of setting up this year in KPERS. We're seeing a lot of Band-Aid fixes to the KPERS system. I've seen a great bill that would increase the lump sum death benefit from $4,000 to $6,000. But again, that's just a sliver of things we could do for retirees. There's a working after retirement reform bill that on its face looks very good and probably is a good thing. There's a so-called self-funded COLA bill for retirees, and then there's this bill. These things, if passed, may be tipping the scale ever so slightly in the right direction, but I believe it's setting up a false sense of security for those of us who really want reform. And so let me explain again, back to my understanding of this building. And most of you will understand this dynamic as well because you've all been here for quite some time. Every year you have individuals coming to you asking for legislation, and legislation. And most of that legislation is tied somehow to money. And what happens is when we fix, whether it's big or it's small, when we make a fix, generally that group gets shoved to the end of the line. Maybe not purposely, but that's just human nature because you guys have so many things that you have to do. And I'm feeling like all of these KPERS bills are setting up this false sense of security where we can say, we passed a COLA this year, we reformed Tier 3, we made it easier to work after retirement, so we can work on other things for the next, however many years you decide. And I'm just hoping that that's not the case, and I'm pleading to you guys that that's not the case. If everything that I've mentioned here, these bills that I've mentioned, become law alongside real reform, then great. But these alone, again, is setting up that dynamic that really concerns me. So I want to offer a comment that may sound provocative, but with all due respect, it's not targeted at anybody on this committee. I know most of you fairly well. I know some of you very well. and I know none of you are bought and paid for. So please don't take this the wrong way. But in my years up here, I've noticed that if you have enough money and if you can hire enough lobbyists, you're going to get what you want. Everybody gets what they want up here if they have enough money and enough lobbyists. But if you're from a sector of wage earners that are asking for things like raises, restoration of due process, fair retirement in capers, it always seems like now is not the right time. We'll get you sometime down the road. So I'm asking you guys, please, and I concur with Treasurer Johnson that, or I will even nudge his comments a little farther. We need long-term reform. And again, I ask for you guys to sit down with those that know what they're doing and tackle that long-term reform. Now, being from KNEA, and again, the reason I'm here today is because KNEA is a member of the Keeping the Kansas Promise Coalition. But one thing that we like to complain about is, and we sincerely believe this, is that we're never brought to the table when you guys take education issues before the committees. With that being said, because we feel like we're the experts with that on education issues. With that being said, we're asking you to bring the experts to the table. Let us be there too, and let's tackle that reform. And that's a plea that we make very, very sincerely, and would be there with you and do everything we can to make that happen. I stand for questions.
Tim, thank you. Committee, are there questions? I see none. Thank you much.
Yes, sir.
Committee, what I would like for you to consider, and I'll get with David, I'd like to consider when we work this bill an amendment to take the date back to 22. And then I think there's some policy questions. Number one is the percentage. Is 1% the right number, or is it somewhere between 1 and 2? So that is something I would like for you to consider. And then also, I firmly believe, as Treasurer Johnson does, that if we're going to extend the benefit, we need to know how to pay for it. And adding to the actuarial liability is probably not the best way. And so we would probably need to amend the bill to also require that that comes out of SGF. So that's a policy decision that we'll need to make when we work the bill. And then the second policy decision might be whether we want to take and pay for the local share also, which is a possibility. It doesn't cost that much more, and it doesn't put a burden on our locals. So those are some things for you to ponder over the next week or so. I will tell the committee that one of the recommendations out of the Joint Pensions Committee that Chairman Johnson chaired last year was a Tier 3 study group. We have made that ask to the Senate President and the Speaker multiple times, and hopefully that will come, whether it's during session or after session. That is yet to be determined, but that ask has been made that we can take a more deeper dive into Tier 3 and see if there are adjustments that need to be made. So I realize this is not a complete fix, but I do think it's a way to help with a temporary problem that we had with earnings, particularly for last year. So, any other discussion on this? Okay, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 256, and that completes our work for the day. Appreciate your attendance and your attention. We are adjourned.